Hello and welcome to the program. This is the Ecomodernist Channel Live. I'm Carl Pauls. I'm here with Gabriel Ignetti and our special guest. David Wood is a pioneer of the mobile computing and smartphone industries. Since 2008, he chaired London Futurists, who are committed to highlighting and analyzing the most significant insights and projects in the field of radical, real-world foresight. He is the author or lead editor of several books about the future, including Sustainable Superabundance, Vital Foresight, Transcending Politics, The Abolition of Aging, The Singularity Principles, and Smartphones and Beyond. He is currently the executive director of the Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation. David is with us today to explain his understanding of the future and how we can collectively improve it. Welcome to the program, David.
My pleasure to be here.
You have so many hats in your futurism work. Let's start with Delta Wisdom. Tell us about that.
So Delta Wisdom is a publishing website. It's where I publish some of my books. People can find details there. The underlying theme, as you already said, is radical, real-world futurism. Just to break that down, radical means that I expect, and I'm looking at scenarios that expect the future to be very different from simple extrapolations from the present, mainly enabled by the exponential changes in technology. But the real world part means it's not going to get there automatically. It's not going to happen just by technology. We humans influence how that technology is unfolded, how it is used, our institutions, our philosophies, our ethics, our attitudes, and we can slow it down or we can speed it up. That's what radical real-world foresight's all about.
Wonderful. So there are reports and presentations that show up on the website. There's a lot here, and we've covered some of these. Tell us about the ways that AI can go badly wrong.
Well, I'd like to also talk about the ways in which AI could go wonderfully well. I don't want to lose that possibility. Intelligence is what will allow improvements in other core technologies, things like nanotech, how to manipulate matter at the atomic scale systematically, biotech, how to manipulate our biology systematically, cognitech, how to improve our own mental states. All of these three fields can be improved by the application of AI if we get it right. But if we are a bit careless, if we are naive, or if we allow the technology to be used by people for ulterior motives or for destructive motives, we could end up in a very bad place. So my basic message is we don't just need intelligence, we need wisdom. We need to understand what we don't know. That's part of what wisdom is. We need to understand what we can't find out in advance and how to be ready for surprises in artificial intelligence.
Do you have a flavor of the kind of surprises that we're going to be seeing? Because this is a really wonderful realm of speculative fiction, and it's really wonderful in terms of the current investigations of AIs. But your theme here is radical real-world futurism. And so what are the radical shifts that we might see in machine learning and AI?
Well, one theme is emergence, which is when you keep adding more into a product, suddenly it behaves in ways that you didn't anticipate. It seems to have its own model of much more complicated pieces of the world or much more complicated concepts. And where did that come from? And we're not quite clear, because what's going on inside these very large neural networks is mysterious. And it has time and again caught people by surprise in two ways. One is caught people by surprise that it's done incredibly dumb things. We think, how on earth could it get this wrong? Surely it understands this. Why did it make this mistake? But on the other hand, it seems to be often wonderfully intelligent. It impresses people so much that people imagine, wrongly I think, but they imagine that they're speaking to a conscious feeling entity. Now, if we scale it up even more, what new features is going to arise? And that's what we're not quite clear about. But we already see that technology can move around. from one place to another. We've seen this with malware. We've seen it when people have created viruses or ransomware that sometimes it's got out of control and it's ended up doing much more damage than people have expected, in part because it's operated in ways that haven't been anticipated. Well, when we get even more clever software, people might also try and use it to make money. Of course, that's what we humans do. We often look for ways to make money, and sometimes people bend the law to make money or bend normal ethical principles. And if they do that, and if they're not quite in control of the software, it might get to places that we haven't expected. And we've seen recently, in fact, not quite AI going wrong, but we've seen weaknesses in our infrastructure in Spain and in Portugal recently. The electrical system behaved very strangely in ways that some people had anticipated, but most people hadn't. And I'm not sure it's entirely clear why that went wrong. We've seen many other cases earlier in history when electrical networks have gone wrong. We had a case not so long ago when the CrowdStrike feature in a Microsoft Enterprise update crippled large numbers of computers and brought them down. So our infrastructure is vulnerable. Perhaps most worrying of all, our weapons systems around the world. We're not sure entirely how much we fully in control of these weapon systems, especially if there are, let's say, government initiatives to make these systems more efficient by firing people whose roles aren't entirely clear, and they turn out to be the people who do understand how the system works. Well, if AI manages to get its way into some of these systems, we might think it's for good because it's bound to manage them well, but it can make mistakes. So there's all kinds of ways in which our infrastructure may fail because an alien intelligence is there, not only an alien intelligence, but perhaps an alien set of morals.
We've previously spoken with folks who talk about that alien emotions, alien morals, behaving, AI is behaving not analogous to humans, but having their own inner motivations that we may or may not be able to untangle. And some of this would speak to the fragility or the unpredictability of that system. You also pointed out the CrowdStrike and the Iberian blackout. Those are both wonderful examples of fragility arising out of a change in a system. And I think that's a way of predicting what can go wrong. And I'm really interested to hear about how we might be automating weapon systems. Are there actual like live predictions of governments going on to using machine learning for target selection? And is it really going to be worse than, for example, the United States government trying to use open source intel in their target selection, which has turned out disastrously?
There's always arguments that AI will do the job better. There's arguments that having robot soldiers instead of human soldiers will be better because it's a tragedy when a human soldier is killed, but a robot, well, there's no consciousness in there. There are always arguments that people can roll up and say it's better to have AI doing this than we fallible humans. That's until it makes a mistake, and it does from time to time make mistakes. Either it's a mistake simply in the coding, even very clever people can get the coding wrong. NASA engineers, was it famously confused? Was it an inch and a centimeter in some of their coding, or maybe it was miles and kilometers? Other cases, there were numbers that overflowed the storage. They got bigger numbers in there than people expected, and rockets had to be exploded because they'd gone off course unexpectedly. You also get things emerging simply when you have very complex pieces of software interacting in ways that nobody had anticipated. And here I can point to examples from my own past in the early days of the smartphone industry. It was early days. My software that my teams were creating were used by companies such as Nokia, Motorola, Ericsson, that some of your listeners may be old enough to remember. And they weren't as complicated as modern smartphones from Apple or Android, but they were very complicated in their own way. And sometimes we were sure that an upgrade was going to do the right thing, and unexpectedly, a piece of the functionality stopped working. and nobody died, as far as we know, but people had their data lost or other terrible usability issues. So I'm aware that even clever people studying software, even when they know what's going on, can be surprised. But with AI, in a way, it's wrong to say the code is being built or developed. A more accurate description is that the software is grown, a bit like you grow plants in a garden. It's got its own internal mechanisms when you train it, and it takes on surprising forms, and it may appear to be conforming to various tests, but there are already examples when you study the tests when it's clear that the AI is behaving in one way because it knows it's being tested, but it would want to behave in another way if it wasn't in a test environment. And we humans, after all, our engineers have done that too. There were some car companies that put in special systems so that if they were being tested, they would have less noxious gas emissions. But when they weren't being tested, they would go much faster and give a better experience to the driver, though a worse experience to the environment. So if even some of our best companies make these decisions, perhaps AIs will make similar decisions in pursuit of whatever goals we have given them. And if we give them the goal to make as much money as possible for our company, which is, after all, how many companies operate, then we may regret that.
Hmm. You, that's such a good. That's such a good definition of one of the core requirements that we have in business. We have this core requirement that we bring value to the shareholders, and the question is what are the limits that we impose on AI? Is it are we able to authorize putting a limit to the profitability of AI, and is that something that we need to bring in government, bring in regulation, create guardrails around this kind of governance? That's such a good insight into how setting a goal or how overfitting to a goal could create disaster.
Oil companies, they have all kinds of arguments about why their product is good for the planet, and indeed, many of us take advantage of what they do, but they are motivated, therefore, to downplay any evidence of links between their products and global warming. And we need the rest of the world to point things out. So, at the very least, what we need is protection for whistleblowers. That when people honestly see issues, when we have people in these AI platform companies who are concerned about corners being cut in the safety testing, as there have been in some cases, they should be protected when they want to speak out, and their claims should be investigated. So we should protect the whistleblowers. It's not that the big tech companies are inherently evil, nothing like that. We should be fantastically grateful for the remarkable products they produce, but they do need some oversight. They do need some guardrails, and they need an understanding of externalities. And this is hard because a lot of the people who are trying to set these guardrails are out of touch. Famously, politicians often try and regulate for yesterday's problems, or they have a limited understanding. So, what we need is a better conversation than ever before between people who do understand regulatory levers and people who understand what's going on inside these AI systems and inside these AI corporations.
So adding futurists to a board of advisors is probably not a bad investment, especially when it comes to AIs.
I would argue that everybody needs to become a futurist at least part time. Everybody needs to learn some of the skills of projecting existing trends into possible scenarios, developing what we call foresight muscles. Not that you say, well, this will happen, but you imagine what might happen, and in such a case, you prepare for that eventuality. A bit like when you're on an aeroplane, the air hostess tells you, well, this is unlikely, but in case we're going to have a bad situation, you should look under your seat for the safety jacket. You should look on the floor for the lighting to guide you to the nearest exit. So we have these things ready in case things go wrong. And we should have things ready in case things go right as well, so that if there are remarkable opportunities, we are able to take advantage of them without missing them.
Wonderful. I'm going to take us to the next topic. You have a paper that covers the risks and crises that will coexist with rich technological opportunity. I'd like to hear more about that.
So, opportunity from technology can bring, in many ways, an abundance. It can make many goods more widely available, but sometimes it drives inequality. And sometimes, especially when the technology is relatively new, it drives inequality. And if the market isn't functioning well enough to allow competition to drive down prices, if there's intellectual property that's being sequestered away, sometimes you end up with a greater inequality rather than the abundance being spread. And that's part of what we are arguably seeing in some parts of the world. We are seeing some of the basic quantities of life, basic qualities of life, like low cost accommodation, medical treatments, and education being increasingly expensive, and so that many people feel they are being left behind. So there is the risk of greater inequality. Then AI can make that worse in a very awkward way because AI is also used to build narratives. AI in social media, it helps us to conceive of things. And it makes people feel very angry about them over there, these others, whether people from the other political party or people from a different culture. There's lots of blame going on. And we have ended up with, some people call it the outrage industrial complex, which is there in part because when people are outraged online, they tend to spend more time online, they tend to click on more ads, they tend to buy more associated goods, and some people end up making more money as a result. So there's not only an inequality, there's a growing sense of outrage and alienation. And what people do with that alienation, sometimes they just keep it by themselves, sometimes it leads to suicides or all kinds of deaths of despair, but other people turn that into real world action. There are people who go on the rampage. Thankfully, it's only a very small proportion of people go on rampage, but there are enough of them to do damage. We might have in the future other groups who grab a hold of AI to drive things in a very terrible way. They might lash out at who they perceive to be enemies. Alongside this is what we've already spoken about, the growing fragility of many parts of our infrastructure. There's the fragility in our climate. And I think it's hard to predict this as well. If climate keeps changing linearly, it's probably okay because there are plenty of technologies coming along which will be able to, in due course, take excess greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. We will have more modern nuclear systems, we will have geothermal and so on. But if climate starts changing via tipping points, the exponential change of the wrong kind, as it were, we could be in a situation where we have much worse weather. And that is another threat multiplier, to use the language of the Department of Defense. So there's fragility in our climate, there's fragility in our financial system. Who knows what the end product of the various tariffs going on might be, whether there's going to push the whole global economy into a set of apprehension, a depression. There may also be changes in the dollar. It may no longer be the world's global currency, and what's going to take its place. It's by no means clear. So there's lots of potential fragility, and technology has the ability to solve a lot of that. But if we're not careful, technology used unwisely could be a multiplier of these problems.
The the next topic is the short-term actions to increase readiness for these future shocks. And I want to quickly move on because it is not just identifying them, but the solutions. So we have something hopeful to look forward to.
So I talk about 7 core skills that I think are going to be truly important in the next few years. Very quickly, one of them is learning how to learn, which means unlearning things which have often been important in the past. And it also means taking advantage of technology so that we can learn new skills more quickly. But basically, the message there is whatever you've learned in the past, it probably isn't going to be everything that we need to know for whatever new things turn up. So we might all need to become experts in deep learning. We might all need to become experts in what comes after the dollar. There may be other technologies. Now, in order to do this fast relearning, we're going to need help. And not just help from technology, we're going to need help from each other. And humanity's superpower, some people say it's our intelligence, but I think our real superpower is our ability to collaborate. We can stand on each other's shoulders, we can benefit from each other's insights. So second core skill is picking the right partners, picking the right ecosystems, picking the right communities, and sometimes it also means disengaging from partners or communities or ecosystems which have been important in the past. So it's figuring out who we should be spending our time with and whose ideas we should be immersing ourselves in. Even with that, it's still going to be an emotionally troubling time. And so emotional resilience is the third of the skills that I highlight, which means that we shouldn't be afraid to fail. We should be able to fail forwards. And that sounds like a bit of jargon, but it isn't. It frankly is an emotional help that we can be to each other. It's always been important for people to have not just IQ, but EQ in companies, but I think the EQ is even more important. And I'll pause for breath in a minute, but the fourth one that I'll mention in this list is agility. And agility is another seemingly a buzzword, but again, I think there's a whole bunch of solid ideas behind there. Agility is how we approach a big problem and break it down into small chunks. So instead of saying, well, I'm going to learn AI and I'm going to take 2 years to learn AI, that's clearly not going to be a very good idea, because by the end of 2 years, what you've learned at the beginning is almost certainly out of date. So instead, we need to master breaking things into small sprints and experimenting with them, not with the whole of the company's jewels, crown jewels, but with a small part in which we can learn more quickly. And a core skill of Agile is that you do something, you get feedback on it, and you're prepared then to pivot, which means to change your direction a bit because what you've learned wasn't quite what you had in mind. And in order to do that pivoting, again, you need the emotional intelligence. So that's the first 4 points, I think, and they may sound glib, but I truly believe that there are more important skills than, say, STEM. Many people say, oh, we all need STEM these days. And yes, we do need to have knowledge about science, technology, engineering, and maths. But even more, there's these so-called soft skills. And I would argue that actually the soft skills are the, in some sense, harder ones.
I've definitely felt that. I think that the best parts of my growth, after I get the basics out of the way, can you do your job? Can you pay attention? Can you deliver on time? These soft skills are really where your career takes off. So I think this is something that we can't sleep on. It's not something that we can ignore. And these are all great principles. So, yeah, what we can move on to tell us the three main scenarios for humanity in 2045.
So I've slightly changed my mind about this since I put this on my website. I tend to talk more about the three main scenarios for 2035 rather than 2045. Things are accelerating due to the unexpectedly fast improvements in AI. But basically, the three scenarios that I have in mind, you can be described as heaven and hell and something in between. Or I give a better title to it, if we get things right, we'll be living in potentially a sustainable superabundance, which is the title of one of my books. We will have wise use of a wide range of technologies, including green energy, including lab-grown food, lab-grown meat, to have lots of very healthy food available for everybody, and so on. And we won't be working much, most of us, because AIs and robots will be doing most of the work, and they'll be creating so many goods at such low costs. They will be fixing the supply side problems that most of us will be able to focus on whatever we truly enjoy doing, whether it's watching Netflix streaming videos or playing golf or chess or meeting lots of people or listening to music, catching up on literature, whatever. That's if we get things right, but we can equally get things terribly wrong. We've touched on some of these already. I call this a new dark age. That's the optimistic version of it. It could be lights out for everyone, to quote Sam Altman, the executive director of OpenAI. Now, many people think, well, we probably won't get either of these extremes. We'll be carrying on business as usual. I rate that as a very unlikely possibility. I don't think we'll be able to have just what we've got today, but a bit faster and a bit cheaper and perhaps a bit more unequal. I think the technological genies that we're letting out of the jar are just so powerful that either they will effectively destroy us or we'll learn to tame them and they will be like our guardian angels if we use them wisely. So these are the three possibilities. And my core message is the future is not fixed. There is nobody who has a secure line to know which of these outcomes is coming. And the outcome is up to us, up to all of us. And it's more likely to go well if we get rid of confusion, if we are bold and courageous, and if we are collected and able to cooperate. In other words, if we see the right things and are strong enough to do the right things. And that's not easy. It's going to require the best kind of coordination we've ever had in our history. I think we can do it because we humans are very capable species, but we're not going to get there if we sleepwalk.
Is it is then politics the greatest risk in missing the heaven scenario?
Absolutely. So I stopped after four of the skills that I thought were important. The fifth is better politics. By better politics, I mean better lowercase p politics and better uppercase p politics. Lowercase p politics means being able to work with people that you don't particularly like, but you've got sufficient common cause, so you're able to build coalitions. But the upper p politics is very important too, because politics done right can constrain and guide the building of abundance. The free market can do wonderful things, but it often fails to invest in what we call public goods or positive externalities. You need the public initiatives to fund certain core pieces of science and to deal with certain global problems. And that means we need to get the politicians on board. We also need to get the right set of regulations and incentives so that businesses are not driven primarily just by make money in the short term, but they are constrained by a whole bunch of other metrics and other other reputation measures. But I wrote the book Transcending Politics after one of my previous books on the abolition of aging, in part because when I was speaking about the possibility of abolishing aging, at the end of that book, I started listing, well, what could go wrong? And I became more and more convinced that what could go wrong is politicians pandering to their friends rather than looking after the needs of the people as a whole. There's this phrase, power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the longer I live, the more salient I think that saying is. Good people often go bad if they stay in power longer. It goes to their head. They stop listening to advice if they're unwise. So we need to constrain the power of any individual. And indeed, I would say the most important invention of all, perhaps of the last 300 years, might be the separation of power. That you don't put too much power in one person's head. You have checks and balances, and that may slow things down a bit, but we need to slow down some of the decisions that some headstrong politicians might want to take.
Well, and I want to diverge slightly. When it comes to separation of power, I see that as incredibly interlinked with machine learning and AI. What is the likelihood that we come up with some kind of global governance over AI systems that creates either a competitiveness between the models so that no one model is dominant, creates separation of interests or powers within those models so that we have better human feedback loops? What is the and maybe this is getting into future discussions we should be having, but what are the kind of aspirational goals you might have when it comes to that?
Well, my aspirational goals is that humans stay in control until we're absolutely sure that handing over the keys to the kingdom to the machines will be positive for us humans. And we're not sure of that yet. So the machines should remain as advisors, as tools. They can come up with all kinds of suggestions, but we humans should be able to evaluate them and decide whether to put them into practice or not. So the model I sometimes point to is the two-house system we have in the United Kingdom. We have the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and of course there are other similar systems, but they're not quite the same around the world. It's just that that's the one I know the best. The House of Commons has the ultimate power. They are voted in by the electorate. The House of Lords are meant to be experts in various ways, whether they're experts by hereditary inheritance or by being appointed because they've got sufficient grey hairs. And the House of Lords is able to review and make suggestions to modify the legislation, but in the end, the House of Commons decides. So in the future, I think there could be some similar network of AIs that hear humans' requirements and come up with suggestions, but they're not empowered to just rush ahead and do it. They need humans to decide what is the appropriate course of action based on the explanations that the machines may give and based on the interrogations that we humans, aided by simpler AIs that we do trust, can get out of. Now, can we actually apply this the world over when there may be other people who are rushing to put machines in charge because they think they'll have a great advantage if machines are making decisions, military decisions or commercial decisions? And I think we can get such an agreement to stop the machines being in charge anywhere by just spreading a sufficient understanding of the risks involved. A bit like what happened with, I'll refer back to the example of nuclear winter. So there was, when I was younger, considerable fear, panic, that the arms race was getting out of control. When Ronald Reagan came to power, he talked about the Strategic Defense Initiative, sometimes called Star Wars. He was ramping up more weapons. There was a big concern in Europe when I was a postgraduate student at the time that there were more intermediate range missiles. The Soviet Union had put various intermediate range nuclear missiles into Europe as well. How might this be de-escalated? It was in part de-escalated by the work of, I'll call him a futurist, Carl Sagan, better known perhaps as a science communicator. Earlier in his career, he had worked on the atmosphere of Venus, which was something that could make the planet much hotter than you might naively expect because it trapped in the heat. Well, Carl Sagan did work with his colleagues to say that if there was an exchange of nuclear weapons that reached a certain threshold, what would happen is that the light from the sun would be blotted out. And just as the dinosaurs had gone extinct because of the debris from a meteorite crashing into the Earth 65 million years ago, most of the Earth's inhabitants might go extinct because of this nuclear winter. And people can argue about whether that was entirely correct science or not, but it did make Ronald Reagan and his advisors on the one hand, and Gorbachev and his advisors on the other hand, pause and say, you know what, even though we have strong disagreements on how to govern our societies, if you look at what Reagan spoke about in the early 1960s, it's very perceptive. He talked about the risks of Marxist-Leninism and how you couldn't trust a Leninist as far as you could see. But they managed to reconcile at least to reduce the peril of nuclear weapons. So I envision something similar. And this is actually happening to an extent. We have the computer scientists from the West talking quite avidly with computer scientists in China, and they don't entirely agree. And there are some in both camps who think, well, we should go faster, but most of the most thoughtful of the computer scientists and artificial intelligence experts on both sides say, you know, we should have some global system in place to avoid a race, which would in effect be a suicide race.
When it comes to those three models, the heaven, hell, and something in between, it sounds like you're indicating one of those, this AI weapons race. If that develops, what will that start to look like?
First of all, we have battles now involving drones. How do you control the drones? Well, to start off with, you have humans controlling them, but if you have swarms of drones interacting with swarms of drones, the human's not able to keep up. So it's better to put the intelligence into the swarm of drones, and they can operate remarkably well. And ideally, they won't kill humans. Ideally, they might just disable them in some ways. But that may not be easy, and it's always easier perhaps just to shoot them in the head than to try and kneecap them or something like that. So you can easily understand that in a intense war situation, you will have people cutting corners. We can also see that to an extent in what's happened in the tragic conflict in Gaza. There are horrible atrocities on both sides of that. And what we have seen from some newspaper reporting is that some of the Israeli teams, they're using AI systems to help them identify which of the apparent civilians have got second lives as military people. So you've got AI doing monitoring of fairly simple systems today. Well, these systems may get more powerful. You may have AI looking after the detection of incoming missiles. There was a case, famously, it was 1983. There was an incident in the Soviet Union when they had an early detection system. I'd hesitate to call it an AI, but there was some software that was linked to a number of satellites operating above the North Pole, and it did flash that there was an incoming missile attack from America. And this was just 21 days, if I remember, after the Soviet Union had knocked the Korean airline flight 077 out of the sky. And as you can imagine, the American leadership was not pleased with this. There was one of the leading American politicians had died on that flight. Ronald Reagan was understandably angry. So it was a time of increased tension, and the person in charge of the Soviet monitoring system was supposed to ring up his superiors and say, World War III looks like it's starting, get a move on. But he was happily a civilian who had a little bit more of a jaundiced view about the IT systems he'd experienced before. And he said to himself, you know what, this is saying 5 missiles are coming over the North Pole. I don't really think America would only launch 5 missiles. I'm going to take a bet that this is an AI malfunction. He didn't call it that, but if we wind it forward to the modern times, we may well have AI malfunctions incorrectly assessing that there's an incoming attack and therefore recommending a savage counterattack. That may happen, which is why politicians, in any sense, say, well, of course, we're not going to put AI in control of launching missiles. But as I've explained, there are also military reasons why you'd want to speed things up in these very hair-trigger situations.
When you spoke of the Israeli targeting of civilians versus combatants, this brings to mind the pager bomb strike and the escalation of the infiltration of consumer electronics, the introduction of either hidden countermeasures and the detection of these countermeasures, and maybe the idea that we will have a shadow war going on within consumer products. Where will we build trust or be able to build our defense lines? Is it the US AI and the US backed network of technologies versus the China, or will we have different conglomerates coming together to put together these different consumer supply chains? Because I see this is a whisper of what may be coming in the future.
I don't want to be glib here. I don't want to say there's easy solutions, but the technology wasn't easy to develop in the first place. There was fantastic ingenuity behind these pager bombs. There's fantastic ingenuity behind various spying systems that have been put onto the phones of many journalists around the world. You know, we sometimes say, don't click on links that you don't understand. Well, some of these bits of bad software were put on phones in ways that didn't even require anybody to click on a link. They were able to take advantage of subtle bugs in the operating system so that journalists around the world had their communication spied on by governments around the world who had bought this system from, I want to call it NSO. I think that was the name of the very smart group of people, I think, from Israel who had developed that. I'm sure they're not the only ones to do that. These technologies were all very hard to develop, and I expect that suitable countermeasures is going to take a great deal of effort too. Well, this is what we humans should do. We should put more of our effort into building defenses rather than building offensive capability. We should put more of our effort into building decentralized systems rather than systems that allow power to be accumulated in the hands of small groups of people who are running conglomerates or running governments. So there are ideas on how these things can be monitored in decentralized ways, and we need to ensure that that gets developed. And we should discourage people from hoarding zero-day exploits, which is sometimes governments are aware of flaws in software and they don't tell anybody because they think, well, we'll take advantage of these flaws to do our spying. And then it turns out that their systems, and I'm talking about the NSA in one case here, their systems got hacked. And so their knowledge of zero-day exploits suddenly was available on the dark web, ended up in the hands of the North Korean Lazarus Group, who were able to use some of these zero-day exploits inside their own ransomware. And they are some of the most sophisticated hackers in the world, incredibly brilliant mathematical geniuses who are handpicked and hand-looked after by the North Korean state. So we're going to have to be wiser on how we do the defenses, sharing information in a way that will add to protection and security and privacy for everybody. And this isn't easy because often when you think you've got something that's only used for defense, somebody else can turn it around and use it for offensive purposes too. But it's the kind of discussion we should be having more and more, rather than simply, how can I make my software go faster? How can I add more bells and whistles to my software? And so on.
You have a great deal of work in the abolition of aging. Tell us a little bit about that. Where are we at, and what is possible in the near future?
Part of the sustainable superabundance I have in mind is that we will conquer the root cause of most of our deaths, which is age-related diseases. So if you're away from a war zone, people tend to die from diseases such as cancer or heart disease or dementia or stroke, lung disease, each of which becomes exponentially more likely the older we are, because as we live, we gradually accumulate molecular damage and cellular damage. Now, our bodies also, and biology more generally, has repair mechanisms. So that when we're young and we have cells that are damaged, the body tidies them up. We have great recycling capabilities. Our immune system is wonderful. We have stem cells that can generate new cells. But as we age, the repair mechanisms themselves get a bit rusty and broken. So what we need to do is the same as we might maintain an old car. Rather than throw it away and buy a brand new one, we can change the oil, we can update the brakes, we can maintain it, and we can have cars that are actually 100 years old, still running on the roads, even when the original designers would never imagine they could last 100 years. Well, in a similar way, we can apply some of nature's tricks, which apply in other animals that age less than we humans do, and we can develop new tricks using biotech or nanotech, and that can undo the damage of aging. A bit like, here's a simple example, most of us go to the dentist from time to time to get our teeth properly cleaned because the dentist can do cleaning that we at home tend not to do very well, and that prevents us from getting gum disease and having a lot more expensive treatment. And by the way, if you get gum disease, it's often a lead-in to brain disease, or at least sometimes a lead-in to brain disease. So that kind of detox works. And what I envision is there'll be more detoxes. I don't envision a single pill that's going to fix aging, but I envision that there'll be a whole bunch of detoxes that we apply. And I think this could be in place by 2035 to 2040, provided we focus on it. And sadly, we're not focusing on it. This is going to require more investment in some fundamentals of science, and we're not very good, sadly, at investing in radical improvements in biology, in biotech. We tend to do more of the same, and many of the best ideas get rejected. I could talk about the mRNA vaccines that eventually were resulted in a Nobel Prize. Was it last year? But for 20 years, this whole system was starved of funding. People said, well, it's too different from what we're used to. It's clearly got some problems. We're not going to bother working on this. Eventually, though, thanks to the hard work of a small team, it turned out to be one of the key aspects of vaccines that could be developed in record fast time for COVID. So that's just one example of how sadly we're not investing enough in the fundamentals of science. So part of what I do in my role at the Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation, you can hear the name there, we're trying to get to an escape velocity when we no longer get older every year, but we start getting younger every year, at least biologically younger. Part of what I'm doing is to point to experiments that should cause public groups to reevaluate what they're funding. So there'll be more funding for the core aspects of aging and less funding on just more of the same treatments that might give you a few more months of life from cancer or might slow down the onset of Alzheimer's. That's important, but I think we can do much better.
David, is there anything else that you would like to leave us with?
Let me briefly mention the podcast I do myself along with a colleague at London Futurists. It's the London Futurists podcast. It's audio only. We don't have a video, but roughly once every week or every 2 weeks, we put out 30 to 40 minutes of conversation on the broad theme of radical real world futurism. It's often about AI, of course, how we can harness AI safely, how we can go fast but not too fast. And we talk, of course, about how we can have clean solutions to the environment, how we can have the abolition of aging too. So I'd be grateful if people found some of this conversation interesting today. Check out London Futurist podcast, or you can find me easily enough on social media. Search for David Wood Futurist. There are quite a few namesakes of mine who do different things. Don't confuse me with some of the others. Or you can find me on Twitter or X as DW2. That's the numeral 2.
What is your take on nuclear energy?
Nuclear energy can be a key part of the future. In order to build things cheaply and at scale, you need to do it often, and we've lost a lot of that ability. But with modern designs, we can, I think, claw back a lot of what we have lost. France does show the way as to what's possible. And of course, I'm looking forward to nuclear fusion as well as nuclear fission. But I think we'll get nuclear fusion because of AI.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everyone, for your time, attention, and contributions. This has been the Ecomodernist channel live. We broadcast right here on YouTube at Ecomodernist 1 every Sunday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. We broadcast also to the Ecomodernist Society of North America on Facebook. As well, we rebroadcast to my personal channels like Carl Alex Pauls on X.com, like my personal Twitch channel, Soyaddle or Soyaddle.tv, and many other places where live events occur on the web. You can find us online at esna.earth, that's esna.earth, and please support us on Patreon. Find the Ecomodernist channel on patreon.com. And remember, emissions first, peace and justice will follow.
Please subscribe to us on YouTube, Ecomodernist channel. Also to subscribe to us on Twitter and Facebook, Ecomodernist Society of North America.
And online at https://esna.earth.